The chandeliers at Hartwell Manor burned so bright that winter that the guests had to tilt their faces away from them, squinting through the light as though they were looking at something too beautiful to hold for long. There were 400 people in that ballroom, 40 musicians in the gallery above. There were women in gowns that had taken 6 months to sew, men in uniforms decorated with medals earned in wars most of the younger guests had only read about. There was food on long tables that nobody touched because nobody wanted to be caught eating. There was laughter and music and the particular perfume of 400 people trying very hard to appear as though they were not trying at all. And in the far corner of the room, beside the tall window that looked out onto the frozen garden, there was a man standing completely alone. His name was Edmund Graves. He held the title of Duke of Ashcroft, and he had held it for 14 years, since his father died of a fever in the autumn of 1873. He was 41 years old. He stood exactly 6 feet 2 inches tall. He had dark hair with a streak of silver at the left temple, and his posture was so straight and so still that from a distance, in the candlelight, he looked less like a man and more like one of the stone figures carved above the doorways of old churches. He was not speaking to anyone. No one was speaking to him. This was not an accident. The woman nearest to him, a baroness in a green gown with feathers in her hair, had been standing approximately 8 feet away for the past 20 minutes. She had not moved closer. She had not moved away. She existed in a kind of suspended state, turned just slightly sideways, the way a person positions themselves when they want to appear as though they have simply stopped in a particular spot for no reason, and not as though they are actively keeping a distance from someone standing nearby. The young man beside her, presumably her son from the matching green in his cravat, had been trying for 10 minutes to work out how to steer his mother further into the room, without saying directly that this was what he was doing. He had so far offered her a second glass of wine, pointed out a painting on the far wall with exaggerated interest, and pretended to hear someone calling her name from across the room. None of it had worked. She had smiled politely at all 3 attempts and stayed exactly where she was. This was what the room did, around Edmund Graves. It adjusted. It rearranged itself quietly, the way water rearranges around a stone in a river, so that there was always a clear space around him, always a radius of empty floor that no one crossed without a reason. People had learned, over 11 years of these events, that approaching the Duke of Ashcroft required either business or necessity. A footman could approach him with a tray. A host could approach to welcome him. A government minister could approach if there was something of substance to discuss. But a woman in a ballroom, on a winter evening, with the orchestra playing a Viennese waltz and the champagne fresh and cold, did not approach Edmund Graves, not to dance, not for conversation, not for anything that did not have a clear and practical purpose. This had not always been the rule. Once he had danced. People who had been attending these events long enough, who had been present in this same ballroom or others like it during the years before, could remember it. The older women remembered it most clearly, because they had watched him with the particular attention that older women give to young men who are beautiful in the way Edmund Graves had been beautiful at 29. He had laughed easily then. He had moved through a crowd the way confident people do, without hesitation, reaching for a glass, turning toward a voice, never stopping to calculate whether it was safe to take up space. He had danced 3 times with a woman named Clara Whitmore at the Hartwell Winter Ball of 1876, and everyone who had been watching, which was everyone, had understood immediately that something was happening between them. Clara Whitmore became Clara Graves 7 months later. She died 16 months after that. She was 27 years old. She had caught a fever in late November, and it had moved quickly, and by the time anyone understood how serious it was, there was not enough time to do anything, except sit beside her and wait. Edmund had sat beside her for 6 days. When it was over, he had stood up, walked out of the room, and he had not spoken of her to anyone in the 11 years since. This was what the room knew. Or rather, this was what the room believed it knew, because the truth of those 6 days, and the years that had followed, belonged only to Edmund and to whatever private interior he had built for himself, in the space where a marriage should have been. The room knew the shape of the loss. It did not know the weight. What the room knew for certain was this: he had not danced since. Not once. Not at a single event in 11 years of events. He had attended them all, because a man of his position and his obligations attended them, and because absence would have caused its own kind of talk. He stood, and he drank 1 glass of wine over the course of an evening, and he spoke when spoken to by the right people, and he left at a reasonable hour. He did not dance. He did not seek out conversation. He did not smile in the way that people smile when they are genuinely glad to be somewhere. He was present in the way that a fact is present, there, acknowledged, but not engaged with. The orchestra finished 1 waltz and moved seamlessly into another. On the floor, couples turned and shifted and laughed at things their partners said into their ears. Near the doors, a group of young officers were making someone laugh so hard she had to press her hand over her mouth to keep the sound contained. Across the room, an elderly lord was asleep in a chair with magnificent confidence, his chin on his chest, his medals gleaming. Life was happening everywhere in that ballroom, richly and noisily and without reservation. Edmund Graves watched the garden. The garden was dark. There was snow on the paths and on the top of the stone wall that ran along the far edge of it, and the light from the ballroom windows fell onto the white ground in long gold rectangles. Nothing moved out there. There were no footprints in the snow. It was perfectly still, the way outdoor places become still in deep winter, as though the cold has pressed everything into silence, and the silence has decided to stay. He looked at it the way a person looks at something they are not really seeing, which is to say he was looking at it without interest and without purpose. It was simply somewhere to direct his eyes that was not the room. He had been standing at this window for 40 minutes. A footman had brought him wine at the 20-minute mark. He had accepted it and thanked the man by name, because he knew the names of all the staff at Hartwell, which was one of those small facts about Edmund Graves that occasionally surprised people who had decided they already understood him. He knew the name of the gardener who maintained the roses. He knew that the head cook had a daughter studying music in Vienna. He knew things that a man of his rank was not expected to know, because knowing them required paying attention, and Edmund Graves paid attention to everything. He simply did not know what to do with what he noticed anymore. That had been the real consequence of the 11 years, not the loneliness, which he had learned to carry the way a person learns to carry an old injury, adjusting their gait until the adjustment becomes natural. What he had lost, more gradually and more completely, was the impulse to act on what he observed. He could notice that the Baroness in the green gown was tired and uncomfortable, and would have preferred to be home. He could notice that the young officer nearest the door was watching a particular young woman with an expression of barely suppressed panic that meant he was about to do something brave, or something foolish, or possibly both. He could notice all of it, the whole living, breathing, complicated room of it, and he could do nothing with what he noticed, because the part of him that used to translate observation into action had gone very quiet and shown no sign of returning. He had made his peace with this. He had made his peace with a great many things. He lifted his glass, took a small sip of the wine, and looked back at the frozen garden. Outside, the snow was beginning again. He could see it in the light from the windows, small flakes drifting down at an angle, quiet and determined. By morning the paths would be covered. By morning there would be no trace of the footman who had carried in wood at 4 in the afternoon. No trace of the gardener who had covered the rose bushes the week before. No trace of anything that had happened before the snow decided to fall. The garden would be simply white and smooth and completely without history. He found this neither comforting nor terrible. He found it accurate. Inside the ballroom, the orchestra played on, the dancing continued. The feathered Baroness finally allowed her son to guide her toward the center of the room, and the space she had occupied for 20 minutes beside Edmund closed, and was filled almost immediately by a young couple who had no idea why the spot had been empty, and who stood in it happily, close together, talking in the private language of two people who are still new enough to each other that every conversation feels like a discovery. Edmund did not notice them arrive. He was watching the snow. He had stood in this same spot, or a spot very like it, at every winter ball for 11 years. He had watched the same frozen garden, or gardens very like it, fill with snow, in the same patient, indifferent way. He had held the same one glass of wine. He had worn the same expression that the room had learned to read as a warning, though it was not intended as one. It was simply the face of a man who had organized his life around stillness, and had stopped expecting that stillness to be interrupted. He did not know, as he stood there that evening watching the snow fall on the path, that in approximately 7 minutes a woman he had never met was going to cross the room and speak to him. He did not know that she would not do it because she was brave. He did not know that she would do it because she had been looking at a fern. He did not know any of it. He simply stood and watched the garden, and the snow fell without urgency, and the orchestra played, and the room continued to arrange itself carefully around him in the particular shape of a world that had decided, without asking him, that he was better left alone. The fern was in a copper pot beside the window. It had no business being there, and anyone who knew anything about Nephrolippus exaltata, which is its proper name, a name meaning essentially nothing to 400 aristocrats in formal dress, could have told you immediately that it was not getting enough light. It was placed, as decorative plants in ballrooms often are, for appearance rather than survival. It looked green from across the room. Up close, if you were the kind of person who looked at plants up close, which most of the guests at Hartwell Manor were not. You could see that it was struggling. The fronds along the lower half were yellowing. There was a particular droop to the outermost leaves that indicated the roots were either too dry or too wet, and from the weight of the pot when she had quietly tested it a moment earlier, Marta Albright had determined it was almost certainly too dry. She had not meant to test the pot. She had not meant to be near it at all. She had been navigating across the room toward the south side of the ballroom, where she had calculated the temperature would be slightly lower and the conversation slightly less relentless, and she had simply noticed the plant on her way past, and stopping was automatic. You could no more ask Marta Albright to walk past a plant in visible distress without stopping than you could ask a doctor to walk past someone who had fallen on the street. It was not a choice. It was simply what she did. She was 33 years old. She had come to England 8 months ago from Cordoba, where she had spent 4 years conducting research on native fern species in the mountain regions south of the city. She had come because the Royal Botanical Institute in London had offered her a fellowship, which was unusual enough that she had said yes before she fully considered what yes would mean. It had meant leaving the dry light of Andalusia for the grey permanence of London winter. It had meant navigating a new city in a second language, in which she was perfectly competent, but occasionally imprecise, in ways that made people look at her with the specific expression of someone deciding whether to correct her, or simply carry on. It had meant, 8 months later, standing in a borrowed dress at a winter ball she had attended only because her host, a kind and relentless woman named Mrs. Helen Fay, had insisted with the particular insistence that is impossible to refuse without causing actual offense. She was not having a bad time exactly. She was having the time of a person who is waiting for a thing to be over so they can return to something they actually want to be doing, which in her case was finishing a paper on spore dispersal patterns that she had been working on for 3 weeks, and which was at a stage where leaving it felt like leaving a door open in a high wind. But the fern was here, and it was in trouble, and so she was here, crouching slightly to look at the base of the pot. The window beside it looked out onto a dark garden. There was snow on the paths and on the wall beyond. She noted this absently, the way she noted everything, and then returned her attention to the plant. What she needed, she decided, was to find whoever managed the plants in this house and tell them, politely but clearly, that this one needed water and needed to be moved 6 feet to the left, where the light from the window would actually reach it. This was a simple task. It required only finding a footman. She straightened and turned. The man was standing directly beside her. She said, in Spanish, something that translates approximately to, "Good heavens," and stepped back, and her wine glass tilted, and she caught it before it spilled, but only just, and for a moment she was too occupied with the glass to look up at his face. When she did look up, she saw a tall man in formal dress, dark-haired, very still, holding his own wine glass, and watching her with an expression that was not unfriendly, but was not exactly warm either. It was simply attentive. He was paying attention to her in the way that felt slightly different from how the rest of the room paid attention to things, which was to say he appeared to actually be looking at her and not at the version of her he had already decided she was. "I beg your pardon," she said, in English now, automatically. "I did not see you there." "No," he said. "You were looking at the plant." His voice was lower than she had expected, not uncomfortable, simply quiet, in a way that suggested it was always quiet, and had no interest in being otherwise. "It is not well," she said, because this was what she had been thinking about, and it came out before she filtered it. "The fern. Someone has put it in completely the wrong position. It needs more light and more water. By next week it will be in quite serious difficulty." He looked at the fern. Then he looked back at her. "You are a botanist," he said. It was not a question. She nodded anyway. "Marta Albright," she said. "I am at the Royal Botanical Institute. Fellowship. I specialize in fern species, which is why I cannot walk past one that is clearly being mistreated without becoming involved." She paused. "I apologize. I realize that is not the usual kind of conversation one has at a—" She gestured with the hand not holding the wine glass, indicating the room, the gowns, the orchestra, the general situation. "No," he said, "it is not." She waited for him to follow this with something. He did not. He simply stood, watching her with that same steady attention, and she had the sudden and unusual experience of being in a conversation where the silence did not feel like something that needed to be filled. "I was going to find a footman," she said, "to tell them about the plant." "I can tell them," he said. "I know which one to ask." She looked at him then with slightly more focus, because a man at a ball who knew which footman to speak to about a plant was not what she had expected, and Marta Albright updated her understanding of things quickly when the evidence required it. "Thank you," she said. "What should I tell them?" "Water it tonight," carefully. Not too much, just enough to dampen the soil to the bottom of the pot. Move it tomorrow to a position where it receives light for at least 4 hours. And do not put it back in a corner for decoration. It is a living thing, not an ornament. Something happened in his expression when she said that. She did not know him well enough to name what it was. It was very small, a slight movement at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile but was in the direction of one. "I will pass that on exactly," he said. She nodded and looked back at the fern. The orchestra had finished one piece, and the musicians were tuning briefly, before beginning the next. Around them the room shifted and reorganized, partners being claimed and declined and sought. She was aware, in the peripheral way she was aware of most things that were not directly in front of her, that the activity of the room had changed slightly, that people were looking in this direction. She was not sure why, and she did not particularly care, because she was thinking about the fern and about her paper and about whether she could find Mrs. Helen Fay and politely negotiate an exit that would not cause offense. Then the orchestra began, and it was a waltz, and she realized she was standing with a man she did not know, in a ballroom where everyone was beginning to dance, and the social logic of the situation arrived in her understanding with the same weight of obligation that had brought her here in the first place. She looked at him. "I do not know your name," she said. "Edmund Graves," he said. The name meant nothing to her, which was apparent on her face, and something about this seemed to affect him in a way that was again too small to interpret and too real to ignore. "Do you dance, Mr. Graves?" she asked. The question came out in a tone that was entirely practical, the way she might ask a colleague whether they had access to a particular piece of equipment. She was not asking because she wanted to dance with him. She was asking because the social architecture of the moment seemed to require it, and Marta Albright, when faced with a social obligation she had decided to fulfilled it directly and without ornamentation. He looked at her for a long moment. "Not for some time," he said. "But you remember how," she said. He said nothing. She held out her hand. She did it the way she did most things, which is to say with her full attention on the thing she was doing, and very little of her attention on how it might appear. She held out her hand not as an invitation, not as a gesture freighted with significance, but simply as the next logical step in a sequence that she had already internally committed to completing. It was the same motion with which she passed a colleague a tool across a workbench. The room stopped. It did not stop in the way that rooms stop in stories, all at once and dramatically. It stopped in the way that rooms actually stop, which is quietly and in stages. One person noticed and touched the arm of the person beside them. That person turned. 2 other people turned because those 2 had turned. Within approximately 10 seconds, without a single person making an obvious movement, the ballroom at Hartwell Manor had rearranged its attention entirely. 400 people, at various levels of awareness, were watching Edmund Graves look at the hand of a woman he had met 4 minutes ago. Marta did not notice. She was looking at him. He was looking at her hand. Then he looked at her face. And then he did something that no one in that room, not the Baroness in the green gown, not the young man with the matching cravat, not the host who had been managing these events for 20 years, had seen Edmund Graves do in 11 years, at every ball and every dinner and every formal occasion that society had required of him. He set his wine glass on the windowsill. He took her hand. It was a small gesture, practical. 2 people agreeing to do a thing. His hand was larger than hers and somewhat cooler, and he held it with the care of a man who had not held a woman's hand in a very long time, and was aware of this, and was choosing to do it anyway. He did not look at the room. He looked at her. "Do not let me step on your feet," she said. "I will try," he said, and they walked onto the floor. A duchess named Margaret Holt set her champagne flute down on the nearest surface. She did not look to see if there was a table beneath it. She simply placed it in the air and let it find something, and it did, and she did not notice, because she was watching the dance floor. She had attended every significant social event in this city for 30 years. She had seen men ruin themselves in a single evening. She had watched 3 prime ministers make decisions at dinner tables that altered policy the following morning. She had been present when the Earl of Westfield announced his engagement to the wrong woman, and when the ambassador from France had laughed at the wrong moment during a state dinner and created 2 months of diplomatic difficulty. She had seen things. She had not seen this. Edmund Graves was on the dance floor. He was dancing. He was dancing with a woman Margaret did not recognize, which was alarming on its own because Margaret recognized everyone, and the woman was not young in the manner of the debutantes, was not wealthy in the manner that clothes announced wealth, and was holding herself with the posture of a person who was concentrating on the footwork because they were slightly uncertain of the footwork, which was the most ordinary and human thing Margaret had seen on a dance floor in years. "Who is she?" said a voice at Margaret's left shoulder. The voice belonged to Lady Constance Ware, 54, the person in any room Margaret most trusted to know things she did not know. "I have no idea," Margaret said. A pause. "That is alarming," said Constance. "Yes," said Margaret. They watched. Edmund Graves, it turned out, had not forgotten how to dance. This was the first thing that became apparent. He moved with the precision of someone who had learned properly, and had not unlearned it simply through absence. The way a language learned in childhood remains in the body, even when it has not been spoken for years. He was careful. He was not spectacular. But he was present on the floor in a way that he was not present anywhere else in the room, and this was the thing that Margaret was watching and could not look away from. He was looking at the woman. Not at the room, not at the floor, at her. On the far side of the ballroom, near the entrance doors, a group of officers had entirely abandoned their conversation. The youngest of them, a lieutenant named George Fendick, had turned so far around to look that his companion had grabbed his arm twice to redirect him and given up. "Is that Ashcroft?" George asked. "It is," said his companion, Captain Philip Wren, who had been attending these events for a decade and was old enough to understand what he was looking at. "He never dances," George said. "Apparently he does," said Philip. "Who is she?" Philip shook his head. "I do not know, but whoever she is," she walked up to him and asked. "Just like that." George stared at the dance floor. "Nobody does that." "One person," said Philip, "clearly does." Across the room, the host of the evening, Lord Arthur Hartwell, became aware of the shift in the room's atmosphere the way experienced hosts become aware of shifts, which is without anyone telling him, through a change in the quality of the noise and the direction of people's attention. He located the cause within seconds, and felt a sensation that was unfamiliar to him. It took him a moment to identify it. It was relief, which surprised him, because he had not known until this moment that he had been waiting for something to happen. He had been inviting Edmund Graves to these events for 11 years. He had been watching the same quiet, contained, careful retreat to the corner window for 11 years. He had never known what to do about it, and so he had done nothing, which is what people do when they care about someone and cannot find a way to reach them. He had kept inviting him, and Edmund had kept coming, and nothing had changed. Until 6 minutes ago, apparently. On the dance floor, Marta counted steps under her breath, slightly off the beat, which meant she was consistently close enough to the rhythm that it worked, but not so close that it looked entirely natural. Edmund noticed this immediately, and instead of adjusting his lead to compensate, which was what a man who had been dancing regularly would have done instinctively, he paused for a fraction of a second on the third beat in each bar, creating a tiny, nearly invisible space that let her find herself. She did not notice that he was doing it. She only noticed that it was suddenly easier. "You are better at this than you said," she told him. "You are doing well," he said. "I am doing adequately," she corrected. "I know the difference." He looked at her, that small movement at the corner of his mouth again. "You are direct," he said. "I find it saves time," she said. "Is that a problem?" "No," he said. "It is not." She navigated a turn that went slightly wide and brought herself back without fuss. "The fern," she said, because she had been thinking about it between steps. "Has anyone been caring for it since it was placed there, or do you think it was simply put there and forgotten?" He was quiet for a moment. Around them couples moved and the music held them all in its particular temporary equality, the leveling force of dancing where the only thing that matters is where you are relative to your partner and what the music asks next. "The estate I live on has a garden," he said. "My mother planted a fern in it, the same variety, I believe." "Nephrolipus," she said. "Yes, whatever the name is. She planted it in the east garden, near the stone wall. It has been there for 30 years. It survived both of us." He paused. "She died 4 years ago." Marta did not say she was sorry, which was the convention, because she had decided years ago that telling someone you were sorry for a loss you had not shared was a strange use of language. Instead, she said, "Is it surviving still, the fern?" "I think so. I do not go to that part of the garden." "Why not?" He looked at her, and this time the look was longer. "She also died there," he said. "Not in the garden, near it, in the room that looks onto it." A different woman would have apologized, would have moved the conversation away, would have managed the moment with the social tools designed for exactly this kind of accidental arrival at something real. Marta held his eyes for 2 beats and then said, "Is the fern all right?" He blinked. "I told you," he said. "I do not go to that part. You can see it from the upper hall," she said. Or from the east path. You do not have to go into the garden itself. I am asking because if it is the same variety as the one inside tonight, it may be showing signs of stress that are fixable, and it would be a shame to lose it, especially if someone planted it deliberately. He did not answer immediately. The music moved around them. His hand was still in hers, very steady. I will look, he said. Eventually. Good, she said. Behind Edmund's left shoulder, which Marta could not see, the Duchess Margaret Holt had pressed her hand slowly over her mouth. Not to suppress laughter, simply because the gesture had arrived before she could stop it, the involuntary response of watching a door open that had been closed for a very long time. Constance was beside her. Her voice, when she spoke, was very quiet. She has no idea, Constance said. No, said Margaret, none. She does not know who he is. She clearly does not. That is why it's working, said Constance. Margaret thought about this for a moment, watching the two figures on the floor, the tall man who had not danced in 11 years, and the woman who was counting steps under her breath. Yes, she said. I think you are right. The music moved through its final phrase. Around the floor, couples began to still, to detach, to bow and curtsy and murmur the small politeness that follows a dance. The waltz drew to its close with the particular gentle falling that good waltzes have, a gradual descent rather than a stop. Edmund and Marta stopped. They stood, for exactly 1 moment, with their hands still joined, and then she stepped back and released him, and looked at her own feet, making a small assessment of how she had done. Thank you, she said. I only stepped on your left foot once. Twice, he said, but lightly. She looked up, and he was watching her with that steady, contained attention, and she thought, for the first time that evening, and not in connection with anything she could yet name, that he was quite remarkable looking, in the way that some people are remarkable looking not because of their features exactly, but because of something in the way they occupy themselves. About the fern, he said. She waited. If you were to look at it, he said, the one at Ashcroft, my estate, if you were to come and advise on it, I would welcome that. It is in the East Garden, and I believe it was planted in a position that may also be incorrect, and I would not know how to tell. She regarded him with the same straightforward attention she gave to all things. I am available on the last Sunday of the month, she said. I have no lectures. The last Sunday, he said. Yes. I will arrange it, he said. And in the room behind them, no one moved for quite a long time. The following morning, the story was already changing. This is what happens with stories. The thing that occurred is real and fixed, a moment in time that cannot be altered. But the moment it enters the possession of 400 people, it begins to transform, shaped by what each person needed it to be, what they feared, what they hoped for, what they had already decided about the man at the center of it. By breakfast, the version circulating among the younger guests was this. A mysterious foreign woman had swept across the room and demanded the Duke of Ashcroft dance with her, and he had been so startled that he had agreed before he could refuse, and on the floor she had whispered something to him that had made him laugh, which nobody had seen in 11 years, and by the end of the waltz, he had been a different man entirely. None of this was accurate. She had not swept, she had not demanded, he had not been startled, he had not laughed, and he was not, by the end of the waltz, a different man. He was the same man he had always been, which was the part of the story that mattered, and the part that the breakfast table version had gotten wrong. He was the same man who had stood at that window for 40 minutes. He was the same man who had not danced in 11 years. He was the same man who had sat beside his wife for 6 days and then walked out of the room and organized himself around silence. He had danced one waltz with a botanist who did not know his history and who had spent most of the dance thinking about a fern. That was all. And yet, he was home by midnight, and the house at Ashcroft was quiet in the way that large old houses are quiet when only one person lives in them, which is a very specific and heavy quiet, the silence of many rooms with nothing in them. He went through the entrance hall, past the library, past the portrait of his father on the landing, up to the room he used as a study. He sat at his desk. He meant to look at the correspondence he had left earlier in the evening, 3 letters that required answers, and a report from his estate manager that he had been putting off. He looked at the correspondence for a time. Then he rose, took the candle, and walked down the hall. He had not walked this particular route in some years. It required passing 2 rooms that he generally avoided, not from any active decision but simply from the same quality of habit that had reorganized his whole life since 1878, the habit of not going toward things that hurt. The hall was cold. The candle made a moving circle of light around him that turned the edges of the portrait strange and the shadows of the furniture large. He passed the room. He kept walking. He came out through the door at the end of the hall onto the small landing that overlooked the east garden. It was dark below. The snow had continued through the night and now covered everything: the paths, the wall, the beds where his mother had planted things in the years when this was a lived-in house rather than a house in which only one room was fully inhabited. He held the candle toward the glass. In the far left corner of the garden, dark against the white, was a shape he recognized: the fern. His mother had planted it in the spring of 1881, in a large stone urn near the wall, because she had read something about the conditions they preferred, and had found this spot by experiment, and declared it correct with the confidence she brought to all things. He had not looked at it directly in 4 years. He looked at it now. It was alive. He could see from here that it was not flourishing, not the way it had been when she tended it personally, but it was alive, the fronds visible above the snow-dusted rim of the urn, still showing green against the white of the garden, still occupying its corner of the world. He stood at the window for a long time. In his pocket was a small card. He had not put it there consciously. After the waltz, when the room had shifted and the conversation had ended and he was finding his coat, a young woman, an assistant apparently to the woman he had been speaking with, had pressed the card into his hand at the door without explanation. He had taken it without thought and had forgotten it until now. He took it out. It was plain, dark ink on cream paper. It said, Marta Albright, Royal Botanical Institute, and below this, in slightly different handwriting, as though added as an afterthought, Sunday mornings, Laboratory 3. Knock twice. He looked at it for a long time. Outside, the fern held its position in the snow. He went to his desk and placed the card on it, carefully, face up, in the center where he would see it in the morning. He looked at it for another moment. Then he sat, pulled the estate report toward him, and began to read. He read for 2 hours. He answered all 3 letters. He was precise and thorough, and he did not rush, which was how he did everything. When he was done, he looked at the card again. Then he picked up his pen, found a clean piece of paper, and wrote a note to his head groundskeeper. It said, Please assess the fern in the east garden and report to me its condition. Do not disturb it. Only observe and describe what you see. He folded this. He set it on top of the correspondence for the Morning Post. He blew out the candle. In the dark, he sat for a moment in the silence of his house, and the silence was the same as it had always been. But it felt, just slightly, less permanent than it had before. He did not know what to do with this. He went to bed. 3 miles away, in a rented room above a narrow street near the Institute, Marta Albright was at her desk with 3 books open around her, and her paper half written, and a cup of tea she had made an hour ago, and not yet touched. Her lamp was low. The room was cold in the way that rented rooms in London are cold in January, a cold that the furniture has absorbed into itself and radiates back at you gently, so that you are always slightly colder indoors than feels logical. She was working on spore dispersal. Specifically, she was working through a section on the mechanism by which certain fern species transmit genetic material across distances far greater than their physical structures should allow, which was the part of her argument that the review committee had pushed back on most sharply, and which she was now rebuilding with more careful evidence. She was not thinking about the ball. She was not thinking about Edmund Graves. She was thinking about spores, which travel on air currents that are invisible to the naked eye, and arrive in places that seem, from the outside, to have been arrived at by chance, but which are in fact arrived at by physics, by the precise and unchangeable logic of pressure and temperature, and the particular weight of things that are small enough to be carried. She wrote this. She looked at it. She thought about it for a moment longer than the writing required. Then she crossed out 2 words, replaced them with better ones, and kept going. At Ashcroft, the fern stood in its stone urn in the snow, alone in the dark of the east garden, alive in the way that things that have been left alone and forgotten are sometimes surprisingly, stubbornly alive. Inside the house, in the study, the small card sat on the desk in the center where it would be seen in the morning. The clock in the hall counted the hours. The house was quiet. It was the last Sunday of January, and the London sky was doing what London skies do in January, which is to deliver light in a way that feels like an apology, pale and thin, and arriving at an angle that illuminates nothing warmly, and makes everything look slightly less than it might otherwise be. Edmund Graves arrived at the Royal Botanical Institute at 9 in the morning. He had not announced he was coming, which he recognized was potentially inconvenient, but the note he had sent 2 days earlier had received a reply that said only, in handwriting that tilted slightly to the right and did not bother with salutations, Laboratory 3, knock twice, which he interpreted as permission. The institute building was older than it looked from the street, wider inside than the exterior suggested, with corridors that went on longer than they should have and smelled of something particular, not unpleasant, a combination of damp soil and something herbal and the faint underlying scent of old paper. There were specimen cases along the walls of the main hall, things preserved behind glass, dried and pinned and labeled in small careful script. He walked past them without stopping, though he noticed them. He found Laboratory 3 at the end of a side corridor. He knocked twice. There was a pause. Then, one moment, another pause. He heard something being moved, the distinct sound of someone clearing space in a hurry, with the specific efficiency of someone who is accustomed to not having enough of it. The door opened. She was wearing a dark work apron over her dress, and had a pencil behind her left ear, and what appeared to be a small amount of soil on her right hand, and she looked at him with the same straightforward attention she had given him at the ball, as though he were a specimen she was prepared to take seriously. "You came," she said. "I said I would arrange it," he said. "People say things at balls that they do not follow through on," she said. "In my experience." "In mine as well," he said. Nevertheless. She opened the door wider and stepped back to let him in. The laboratory was, to his eyes, both orderly and chaotic, which he quickly understood was because the two qualities were operating on different scales. Broad order, shelves along all four walls, specimens in jars, reference books organized by size rather than subject, a central work table that was clearly the heart of the room. Immediate chaos. On the central table were 3 open books, a series of diagrams on loose paper, 2 small potted ferns at different stages of something he could not identify, and a cup of tea that appeared to have been there for some time. "Sit if you like," she said, moving back to the table and picking up the pencil from behind her ear. "Or stand. I need to finish this paragraph while I have the thought." He stood. He looked at the shelves while she wrote. The specimens in the jars were labeled in the same tilting handwriting, names in Latin that he could not read, dates, locations. One said, "Collected, Sierra Nevada, July 1881. Another, Rio Janil Valley, found in partial shade. Another, very small, said only, from the wall of an old house, Cordoba, 1879. She had collected this one from a wall. He found this interesting in a way he could not immediately articulate. "Done," she said, and set the pencil down. "Tell me about the fern." He had brought the report from his groundskeeper. He handed it across the table. She read it without speaking, and he watched her read, which was interesting because she read the way she listened, with complete attention, no performance of it. "The lower fronds are yellowing," she said. "Yes. And the soil is compacted." According to him, yes. She set the paper down. "It is not dying, but it is not thriving. There is a difference, and the difference matters." She picked up one of the small potted ferns on her table and turned it toward him. "Look at this one. See the color of the new growth at the center?" He leaned forward slightly. At the center of the plant, among the older green fronds, there were smaller, brighter ones emerging. "That is what health looks like in this species," she said. "New growth. If your garden fern is not producing new growth in the center, it is in stasis, alive but not moving forward." He looked at the fern in her hand. "Is stasis recoverable?" he said. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "If the conditions change, it needs the right kind of attention, not too much, not too little, and it needs the person doing the attending to actually believe it is worth saving." He said nothing. She set the fern down. "I should come and see it," she said. "Describing it to me is useful, but I would understand it better directly, if you are still willing." "Yes," he said, "I am." She pulled a small notebook from under one of the books on the table. "I am free the second Sunday of February. I can take the morning train. Your estate is how far from—" "I will send a carriage," he said. She looked up from the notebook. "That is not necessary. It is 2 hours by road," he said. "And the February train schedule from this station is unreliable. I have a carriage. It will be no inconvenience." She looked at him for a moment with the expression of a person weighing practicality against the instinct toward independence, and pragmatism won, which he had suspected it would. "Fine," she said. 8 in the morning. Do not send it before 8. I work until midnight most nights." 8, he said. "Yes." She wrote something in the notebook. He noticed that she used the pencil rather than a pen, and that the notebook was nearly full, the pages thick with notes and small diagrams, and the occasional pressed leaf tucked between pages and flattened by use. "Your mother planted it in 1881, she said, still looking at the notebook. "Yes. And tended it herself until she died. 4 years ago. And since then, No one has touched it. The groundskeeper waters it. Occasionally. She nodded slowly. 4 years of occasional is exactly what the report describes. She looked up. We can fix it. I do not promise it will look the way it did when she cared for it. I do not know what she knew about it, how she read its signals, whether she had built up a relationship with it over time. These things matter. Plants respond to consistent attention the same way most living things do. He was looking at her again with that quality of attention that she had noticed at the ball, steady and full. Most living things, he said. Yes, she said simply. Outside, the pale January light shifted slightly. A brief thickening of the clouds, and then a thinning again. A small change that moved through the windows of Laboratory 3, and crossed the work table between them, and then passed. She made a note. He stood in the middle of the room surrounded by the smell of soil and old paper, and the February morning possibility of things that had been in stasis beginning, quietly and without announcement, to move. 8 in the morning, he said, when he was at the door. Yes, she said, without looking up from the notebook. I will be ready. He left. She did not look up as he went, or not immediately. She finished the note she was making, which was about root compaction and the conditions under which it was reversible. Then she looked at the door for a moment. Then she looked at the small fern with the new growth at its center. Then she went back to work. What the city knew by spring was partial and assembled from pieces, the way knowledge of private things is always assembled, through fragments overheard and inferences drawn, and the particular kind of attention that people pay to things they have decided are worth watching. It was known that the botanist from Cordoba had visited the estate at Ashcroft on the 2nd Sunday of February, and on the 3rd Sunday, and on the 1st Sunday of March. It was known because the carriage had been seen, a plain, dark carriage, nothing ostentatious, the kind of carriage that does not attract attention but that people notice anyway because it appears in the same place on a regular schedule, at the house in the narrow street near the Institute, arriving at 8 and departing shortly after. And the same carriage had been seen at Ashcroft, coming up the East Drive at 10:30, and leaving before the light was gone. It was known that the Duke of Ashcroft had attended the Royal Botanical Institute's public lecture on fern ecology in the 3rd week of March. He had sat in the back row. He had not announced himself. He had left before the questions began, but he had been there, and a dozen people had seen him, and a dozen people had considered what it meant, and arrived at a dozen different conclusions. It was known that the fern in the East Garden at Ashcroft had been moved to a new position in February, and that new fronds had been observed at its center by April, which the groundskeeper reported with a satisfaction slightly out of proportion to the event, unless you understood that the groundskeeper had been worried about the fern for 4 years, and had not known what to do. These facts moved through the city's social world the way facts of this kind always move, picking up weight and shape as they traveled, becoming by the time they reached certain breakfast tables something rather more decided than the facts themselves supported. There were those who declared that the Duke of Ashcroft was in love, and that it was only a matter of time. There were those who declared that the botanist was after his money, or his position, or both, and that sensible people would reserve judgment. There were those who said nothing, because they were waiting to see, which is the most honest position, and also the least satisfying. What was not known was what happened on those Sunday mornings in the East Garden at Ashcroft, because no one was there but the 2 people concerned and the groundskeeper, who was a private man with no interest in other people's stories. What happened was this. She came in the morning and went directly to the East Garden because that was why she was there. He met her there, and not at the door, because standing at a door waiting for someone to arrive had a significance he was not ready to claim. In the garden, they were 2 people looking at a plant, which was a thing with a clear and practical purpose, and purpose was the container that made everything else possible. She showed him what to look for. She explained the new growth in terms that were precise without being technical, or rather technical in ways that became precise by her explaining them, so that by the 3rd visit he could look at the center of the fern himself and tell her what he saw without her prompting. She brought books on the 2nd visit. She left them, because there was nowhere appropriate to take them back to except her rented room, and carrying books on a carriage was annoying. By the 4th visit there was a small collection of them in the library at Ashcroft, on the table by the east window, which was the table nearest the garden, and which had previously held nothing but a lamp. He asked questions. This was the thing that she had not expected, which was not that he asked questions. Most people asked questions, but that he asked the right ones. Not the questions of a man managing a garden, not questions about what to do, but questions about why. Why this species in this location? Why the fronds yellowed in that pattern and not another? Why the plant responded differently to different kinds of water, hard versus soft, and what that indicated about how living things communicated distress. She answered him. And in answering him she found that her answers grew, that the act of explaining to someone who was actually listening took her further into her own thinking than she went alone, which was the best kind of conversation and the rarest. They spoke about other things. This happened gradually and without a clear moment of beginning, the way conversations expand when the people having them are comfortable. She told him about Cordoba. He asked what she missed, and she said the light, which was specific and true, a particular quality of afternoon light in the mountain valleys, that turned everything amber by 4 o'clock, and that she had tried to describe to English colleagues and found language insufficient for. He said he had not been south of Paris. She said she had not been to Paris. He said it was worth seeing, but that what people said about it was slightly wrong, that it was not romantic in the soft sense the guidebooks suggested but romantic in the older sense, full of argument and beauty, and the particular electricity of a city that takes itself seriously. She looked at him when he said this. "You have been there," she said. "Several times." "With her," she said, not as a question. A pause. "Once," he said, "before we were married, and once after." She nodded. She looked back at the fern. He did not elaborate, and she did not ask him to. This was the quality of their conversation that made it possible. They moved toward things and then gave each other room, and neither of them forced anything to land before it was ready. He told her about his mother. Not all at once, in pieces, across several Sundays, the way you tell stories about the dead when the telling is not performance but simply what surfaces when you are with someone long enough. His mother had been, he said, a woman who paid attention to the wrong things by society's measure, and the right things by her own. She had known the name of every gardener on the estate. She had kept notebooks, not unlike the ones Marta carried, full of observations about what grew where and why, and these notebooks existed still, somewhere in the library, though he had not looked at them since she died. Marta said, "I would like to read them." He said, "Then you shall." She read them on the 5th Sunday, in the east-facing room with the window that looked onto the garden. She sat at the table with the small growing collection of botanical books and read through 3 notebooks, cover to cover, while he worked at the desk on the far side of the room. She marked pages with slips of paper she tore from her own notebook. She said nothing for 2 hours except occasional murmurs of something between approval and recognition. At the end of the 2 hours she looked up. "Your mother was very good," she said. He set down his pen. "At the garden," she said quickly. "Her observations are precise. She understood things about this fern specifically that took me 18 months to understand about the species generally. She was watching it as an individual, not as a type. That is harder than it sounds." He looked at the notebooks in her hands. "She would have liked you," he said. He said it simply, without weight, and Marta held it simply, without weight, and neither of them made anything of it, which was how it remained true rather than becoming complicated. By April, the fern in the East Garden had produced 11 new fronds. The groundskeeper counted them and reported this in writing, with a pride he did not try to hide. Edmund read the report at his desk. He looked at it for a moment. Then he wrote a short letter, not to the groundskeeper, but to the Institute in London. The letter was addressed to the Director of Fellowships, and it concerned the possible endowment of a research fund for the study of native European fern species, which was a subject he noted that the current fellow was working on, and which he believed deserved sustained institutional support. He did not tell Marta he had written it. She found out 3 months later, when the director mentioned it to her in passing, and her first response was to go very still, and her second was to work out, with the precision she brought to all things, what it meant and what it did not mean, and to arrive at the conclusion that it meant exactly what it appeared to mean, which was that a man who paid attention to things had paid attention to something that mattered to her, and had done something about it, and had not announced it. She went back to her laboratory, and she sat for a long time with her hands flat on the work table and thought about this. Then she wrote him a letter. It said, "I understand you have spoken to the fellowship director. You should have told me. I do not know yet whether I am grateful or furious, probably both. I will tell you which on Sunday." He received this on Thursday. He read it 3 times. He set it on his desk, face up, in the center, where he would see it. He found, for the first time in 11 years, that Sunday was not arriving quickly enough. The last Sunday of April was clear and cold, the kind of spring day that had not yet decided to be spring, the sky sharp and bright and the air still carrying winter's intention in it. The carriage arrived at 8. She was ready. She was wearing the coat she always wore on these Sundays, dark wool, practical, with deep pockets in which she carried her notebook and her pencil, and the occasional small things she had collected on the previous walk. a stone, or a dried leaf, or a seed case she wanted to look at later. He met her at the east gate rather than the house. He handed her a small wrapped package without explanation. She took it, looked at him, looked at the package. She unwrapped it. Inside was a notebook, not hers, not a blank one, but one of his mother's, a fourth notebook she had not read, which he had found behind a row of reference books in the library, and which he had set aside the week before and had now brought out. She opened it. His mother's handwriting. Page 1, dated March 1883, titled, Second Year Observations, East Garden Fern. She looked at it for a long time. She wrote a second year, Marta said. There may be more, he said. I have not gone through everything. She looked up at him in the clear, cold light of a morning that had not yet decided to be warm. We should look, she said. Yes, he said. We should. And they went into the house. The city, 3 miles and a world away, continued its version of the story, which was the version it had assembled from carriages and public lectures, and the things people said at spring dinners, when the wine made everyone slightly more willing to speculate. And that version was not wrong exactly. It had the broad shape of the truth. It knew the Duke had danced. It knew the botanist had come to Ashcroft. It knew that the fern in the East Garden was alive and growing. What it did not know, what it could not have assembled from carriages and lectures and dinner-table inference, was what happened in the library at Ashcroft on the last Sunday of April, when 2 people sat on either side of a table piled with old notebooks, and outside the window, the East Garden fern stood in its stone urn with 11 new fronds, reaching in the particular way that things reach when they have been in stasis and the conditions have changed, not dramatically, not with any announcement, but with the quiet and irreversible insistence of things that have decided to grow. At the winter ball the following December, the Duchess Margaret Holt stood near the entrance with a glass of champagne and watched the room arrange itself in the way it had arranged itself every year for as long as she could remember, the musicians in the gallery, the food untouched on the long tables, the particular hush of 400 people trying to appear as though they were not trying. Then she saw them come through the door. Edmund Graves, the same as he had always been, tall and contained, his posture the same right angle it had always been. And beside him, a woman in a wool dress that was not quite formal enough for the occasion but was worn with the complete absence of concern that makes such things irrelevant, a woman with a pencil behind her left ear that she had clearly forgotten was there. They were speaking to each other, quietly, close together, the way people speak when the conversation between them has become a habit they carry into every room. They crossed the floor. He stopped at the edge of the dancing and held out his hand. She looked at it. I know how to dance now, she said. I have been practicing. Have you? He said. I stepped on a colleague's foot twice, she said. Not once. Progress. He was smiling. Not the small, careful movement at the corner of his mouth that she had seen on the first night. Fully, openly, in the way that people smile when they are genuinely glad to be somewhere. She took his hand. Behind them, across the room, the Duchess Margaret Holt pressed her hand slowly over her mouth, not to suppress laughter. Not exactly. Simply because the gesture arrived before she could stop it, the involuntary response of watching something that had taken 11 years and a fern and 2 people who were themselves with complete consistency in a room full of people performing, and that had arrived, at last, without any announcement, in its own time. Constance was beside her. She was the only one, said Constance. Yes, said Margaret. On the dance floor, the orchestra began. They moved.